Hello, my name is Stephen Barani. Bonjour à vous tous et tous. Toutes, je m'appelle Stephen Barani. I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa in Development Studies and a member of CIPS, the Center for International Policy Studies. And today it's my pleasure, on behalf of CIPS and our partners, Global Affairs Canada, to welcome you to a panel on why do donors' approaches to aid effectiveness differ. Now, the answer to that question may seem obvious to some of you, but as the book, which will be presented by author Simone Dietrich today, as her book indicates, in fact, there's been very little research on different donor approaches, different Western donor approaches, and particularly on the factors, domestic factors and others, that shape their differing approaches to the aid effectiveness agenda, to whether they invest in building the capacity of the host state, for example, or whether they bypass that state, particularly where there are major governance challenges. Of course, it's the link to major governance challenges that interests the Fragile States Research Network, which is part of CIPS and which is co-hosting this talk today. The event will be mainly in English, mais tous les auditeurs francophones sont bienvenus d'exprimer ou de poser vos questions dans le chat ou verbalement à la fin en français. Et nous serons ravis d'y répondre en français dans la mesure du possible. Let me then introduce our panelists, starting with Dr. Simone Dietrich, who is an associate professor at the University of Genève. In addition to the book that she'll be profiling today, States, Markets, and Foreign Aid, just published by Cambridge University Press, Dr. Dietrich has worked as a practitioner in international agencies and non-governmental organizations in various regions, particularly the Balkans, the Caucasus, and in Central Asia. The second panelist and first commentator will be Drew Smith, who is currently Director General of International Assistance Policy at Global Affairs Canada. Drew has many achievements to his credit, but including the co-design or the design that he led of the and the launch of Canada's $1.6 billion International Assistance Innovation Program. He also led the Pan-Asia Regional Development Assistance Program, and he's worked in the field and as head of cooperation in Vietnam, among other places. And last but not least, our commentator will be Dr. Syed Sajadur Rahman, or Sajad for me for short, who is now a professional in residence at our School of International Development at the University of Ottawa. Before that, he had a distinguished 21-year career at the Canadian International Development Agency, which was our agency before it got merged with Global Affairs Canada. He was head of Asia branch. I think he and Drew worked together there and in other capacities. Associate Vice President of Policy, and he's also written widely about international development issues, including on middle-income countries as new partners in Development Cooperation Program, a project that I've had the pleasure to collaborate with him on in recent years. So this should leave us about 20 minutes for questions and answers at the end from you all. So without further ado, Dr. Dietrich, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Stephen, for the kind introduction. Thanks to the Center for International Policy Studies, University of Ottawa, and the Global Affairs Canada for setting up this event and giving me the opportunity to present my book. I would also like to thank my discussants, Sajad and Drew, for taking the time to read and engage with my book and offering a critique on its merits, and hopefully providing thoughts on how the findings and implications travel in their respective fields. And I also want to thank the audience for coming today. I will be glad to answer any questions on Q&A, and very much look forward to having a good discussion today, which might also bring about new ideas for research that is relevant for scholars as well as practitioners. And so let me now turn to my book, and for that I will share my screen, the presentation. And so books are big, but I'm going to attempt to distill it into 20 minutes in which I will motivate the research question, present the argument, describe my empirical strategy and findings, and then talk about the implications of the book for current debates about foreign aid effectiveness and the future of foreign aid. And so my book asks the following questions. Why do donor countries, and here I talk about 23 OECD DAC donor countries, engage in markedly different policies under similar recipient country and international economic conditions? And so when we look at the data, for example, we see that in poorly governed states, some donors like the US and the UK have a tendency to work around recipient governments to deliver their aid, while donors like Germany or France or Belgium have pursue a more government engagement route. And so this is the empirical puzzle of the book. And I argue that thinking about these differences in, or what it is that explains these differences, can help us grapple with important challenges around aid effectiveness, donor coordination, or the promotion of standards and best practices in development. But so in a first step, let me define what I mean when I talk about different development tactics. I distinguish crudely between donor engagement with recipient authorities and the bypassing of recipient authorities through non-state actors. So on the left side, you see a government building in Colombo, Sri Lanka, but this really could be anywhere in the developing world that signifies donor engagement with recipient authorities where they play a direct role in the implementation of aid. So this could be budget or programmable aid, but also project aid that involves authorities in the implementation process. And this mechanism provides a way to bring in local hierarchies, local gravitas, which should make aid, goes the saying, more relevant and thus more effective. On the other hand, I have what I term a bypass strategy. This is a sort of a catch-all category that includes a range of different delivery actors. On the top, you can see a screenshot of Chemonics, which is a familiar player in the world of for-profit development. Below is a screenshot of CARE International, an international NGO that works with local counterparts in the developing world. Then we have Gavi, which is a public-private partnership that promotes private sector investment in vaccine delivery. Or we can imagine more screenshots of actors such as IO trust funds that have moved in the development space to capture some of the funding. And one important idea associated with bypass is that it gets aid directly to the people, especially in environments where the quality of governance is low, and working with recipient authorities poses fiduciary and results risks to donors. And so this too is expected to make aid more effective. Importantly, however, these approaches, bypass or engagement, come with trade-offs. And so let me begin with bypass. The picture on the left, I have one of a PEPFAR clinic in Mozambique that treats a young patient who has HIV/AIDS. We see equipment in the background, which signifies plenty of resources to combat HIV/AIDS across the world. As you might know, PEPFAR is a targeted vertical health program put in place by George W. Bush in 2003, whose objective is to combat the global HIV/AIDS pandemic. And the program is funded and implemented by the US and implemented by non-state actors. So it is a prime example of bypass. In the United States, PEPFAR has long been considered a golden goose in aid programming, continuously supported across partisan lines and funded above levels requested by the government. And it is a very popular program because it has managed to make programs very legible. So in terms of their results to a domestic audience, both skeptics, but taxpayers more broadly, on an annual basis by counting the number of people treated or lives saved. All the while fulfilling efficiency and value for money criteria that score points even with the most critical towards foreign aid. And on the other hand, you see a photo of a government-run clinic in Mozambique that has huge capacity issues, and in this particular instance is not able to provide adequate treatment for other important health problems like diabetes or adequate maternal care throughout a woman's pregnancy. So what we observe is that there are important inequalities in health structures in recipient countries, and there are even studies that document that setting up vertical structures like PEPFAR, but this really travels outside even the global health space, can undermine local health systems in different ways. For example, through a brain drain, if you will, where doctors and personnel who get better training and salaries in externally funded interventions will move away from publicly funded clinics to work with better endowed clinics. And aside from these unintended, what I think are unintended consequences, research has also shown that bypass can affect politics in recipient countries. For example, bypass has been shown to mute popular resistance in dictatorships by subsidizing government spending and rendering citizens less willing to openly challenge the incumbent through protests, or bypass has been shown to cause repressive governments to lash out against implementing actors and thus potentially weakening civil society in the country. And of course, these are outcomes that donors care about. Now, aside from bypass, there are also trade-offs associated with government-to-government aid. I think we've all heard people who work in that development space of anecdotes of aid capture by elites, which to fund private mansions or private planes. A recent study by Anderson et al. Show that aid disbursements to highly aid-dependent countries coincide with sharp increases in bank deposits in offshore financial centers that are known for bank secrecy in private wealth management. And Montinola and Konosh have shown in their research that aid, government-to-government aid, can strengthen autocrats in the long run because autocrats can stockpile aid for use against future economic shocks that might threaten their grip on power. And so government-to-government aid can strengthen autocratic rule, which again is an outcome that donors care about. And so from an empirical perspective, if we look at how donors commit their aid in terms of the different channels of delivery, what we see is that donors position themselves differently, systematically, and differently on these trade-offs. And that they have systematic preferences for more bypass and more engage. And as I said in the beginning, when I talked about the empirical puzzle, I said that in countries with poor governance quality, we see that the US, UK, but also Scandinavian countries tend to bypass recipient actors more than donors like Germany, France, or Belgium that tend, regardless of the risk, tend to work with recipient governments. And so the answer, and this is sort of where my book comes in explaining this empirical puzzle, my book argues that we can find the answer to this question by looking at national structures. And the novelty of the book, if you will, is the suggestion that in order to understand countries' approach to foreign aid, how they deliver aid abroad, or how they interact with recipient governments or civil society, in order to understand that, we must analyze aid agencies as domestic agencies first. And approaching aid that way reveals that foreign aid does reflect and mirror domestic ideational orientations and policies of the donor country. And so in my book, in the argument, I identify aid officials inside aid agencies or national aid agencies or relevant ministries as key actors whose decisions help us explain the extent to which donors engage more or less with recipient governments. But importantly, that these decisions have less to do with how officials want to promote aid at any given moment or what the evidence says aid officials should do or what is best or most effective. But rather, this pursuit of international development has its origins in how donors structure accountability, how donors address risk domestically across the board, including foreign agencies, and more specifically, how these different structures are connected with rules that apply across the board. And so the argument is mainly one about how aid agencies or countries broadly are structured to ensure accountability. And these structures then incentivize aid officials to work in a particular direction, more bypass or engagement, and which often precludes the other. Now, across the donors that I examine, the data show that until the 1970s, donors deliver aid in quite similar ways, and this is mostly through the government-to-government channel. But the crisis of the welfare state that becomes apparent in the 1970s in the form of economic and financial crises not only laid bare the challenges of globalization, but it represents a historical juncture that has encouraged then, and there is research on this in political science, in historical institutionalism, that then promoted notably Anglo-Saxon countries to dismantle their states and to implement comprehensive managerial reforms, including national aid organizations, to address these challenges associated with globalization. And so if we think of USAID as a very good example or case in point, USAID used to be a large implementing organization that would deploy its experts across the world. Its role today, ever since the Reagan administration, has been dramatically reduced from rowing to steering, to borrow from a public administration terminology, which really focuses on managing aid contracts that rest on a particular type of accountability system. And I argue that it is one that takes its inspiration from neoliberal or managerial ideas. And so essentially, it is this organizational change or this bureaucratic solution to globalization challenges that not only affects the structure of aid organizations, but that also then incentivizes aid officials to do more or less of bypass, or more or less of engagement. And so broadly speaking, in my book, I distinguish between two donor types. One type, which I term managerial or neoliberal, that operate on this on a logic that mimics private sector governance, right, including the imposition of individual accountability, that the emphasis on incentives, competition, and performance. And the objective of this kind of bureaucratic structure or organization is essentially to minimize risk in aid delivery and to make aid legible to taxpayers and critics in the short run. And so the institutional rule books or the guidelines are essentially set up to incentivize manageable projects that are evaluated and measured in regular intervals using quantitative indicators that often black box country contexts, right? And that often don't allow processes to play out in a non-linear fashion in the longer run. And so because this managerial institution, right, is in large part derived from the delivery of specific results, the rule books are going to be set up to incentivize aid officials to make decisions that maximize this objective. And so the hypothesis is that when there are problems of governance in recipient countries, managerial structures are more likely to incentivize aid officials to bypass, while traditional public sector donors, those that have not undergone comprehensive managerial or neoliberal reforms, are sticking less or are less pushed towards the bypass option. And to them, the obvious counter question to this managerial approach is, what happens when this project comes to an end, and what systems are left behind? Do donors perhaps even cannibalize, if you will, the system by setting up these vertical projects that chop up the health system into different parts, and that may allow them to shine at home because they're effectively able to say that they delivered on their promises. But in the end, even setting up water taps, for example, may be useless for the villagers if there is no underlying functioning water grid system that obviously has to come from and be built through recipient authorities at the local and national level. So these counterpoints were consistently raised in interviews with aid officials from more public sector economies. Now, I've talked about sort of the hypothesis I have when making comparisons across donor countries, but there's also an over time element in the argument which suggests, which generates over time expectations. And so this is a cartoon that I actually found after I started working on this research, which captures sort of the managerial moment very nicely, in the sense that bureaucratic reorganization, right? And this is sort of the movement, the dynamic movement by the aid bureaucrat. Now, with this change, and here this is a cartoon that appeared in the UK, the aid official now is turning away from funding the government, but is more directly going to the students in schools to deliver aid. And so there is a cross-donor expectation, as well as an overtime expectation. And in my book, I investigated these two hypotheses with different methods. So I estimate statistical analysis of foreign aid delivery tactics using commitment data across 23 OECD donors and their aid recipients. I then conduct systematic interviews with aid officials across different countries, and my key countries were the US, UK, Sweden, Germany, France, and Japan for the individual level survey. And so because my argument is really constructed around the aid official, I have country level data that supports the cross-donor hypothesis, as well as individual level data that also supports the claim. And then I also collected public opinion data to explore the preferences of publics as a potential alternative explanation. But I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A. And then the overtime component, and really getting into the causal mechanism that suggests that it's really institutions that constrain aid delivery, was accomplished through comparative research on the organization of aid bureaucracies across donors of different types. And here I have them in the parentheses, and there I took a deep dive into their organizational structures and practices and their domestic outsourcing patterns. And across all the levels of analysis, the hypotheses are confirmed. What does this mean for aid effectiveness as a debate? It suggests that beliefs or ideas that were locked in years or decades ago, so meeting globalization challenges by dismantling the state, continue to shape donor decisions about how to deliver aid today in the countries that took that route. I argue that it also shapes, these beliefs shape not only the delivery tactics, but also the mandate of the organization and the kinds of objectives and metrics the organization uses to document success. And importantly, that aid officials can't really easily optimize or change these tactics or development approaches, but that they are quite stable and sticky because they are underwritten by rules that incentivize aid officials to act in a particular direction. For new deliveries or any kind of innovation to be or to become to be practical and implementable, they have to align, therefore, with the underlying ideas or ideological orientation. It also suggests that paradigmatic stable changes in aid delivery require comprehensive institutional reforms if they are meant to become sticky. And it suggests that not all aid organizations are set up to expertly promote results in capacity building or short or long-term development efforts, which are both important for development. And finally, what we find is that, or I find, is that like-minded donors tend to work together more than donors that differ in their ideological orientations. And finally, and this is research I'm working on today, I'm examining or I find evidence that these different structures, these national structures, also complicate agreements about what constitutes best development practices at the level of the OECD DAC or the international level, where donors come together and debate over best solutions towards development. And so I'm going to leave it here and look forward to some reactions, and happy to elaborate further should there be questions or interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simone, for this snapshot of a very dense and complex and fascinating book. So without further ado, Drew, I'll turn the mic over to you for the first comments.
Great, thank you, Stephen. I don't want to take too much time. I want to leave as much space as possible for Q&A. I have 4 relatively brief comments. One is, and first, let me thank you, Simone, for your book and for your presentation today. It's a great contribution to, as Stephen's saying, a complex issue and one that I think deserves more attention. Okay. Just in terms of the transition within donor delivery systems, I think it's very important, the points you've made, Simone, about transitions within domestic contexts and how that's shaped the evolution of donor agencies. I think equally important, though, is what we've learned about and learned about the way countries develop over time, and the differentiation between countries. You know, if we go back to the Colombo Plan, or we look at the U.S. in particular, I think South Korea was probably until the mid-70s maybe the largest recipient of U.S. aid, and of course the relationship with South Korea was very different from the relationship one might have with a sub-Saharan African country. So we've learned a lot about how best to work with developing countries. I think part of that is that governance is key. That's something that certainly the World Bank and work that they did empirically, recognized the importance of institutions, the importance of state capacity, government capacity, to ensure the sustainability of aid investments over time. So that's something we know. We don't always live by it. We don't always support governance in the way that maybe we should, but we do know that, and our systems are designed to try to support institutions and governance systems as much as we can. Second point is that I think your point, Simone, about incentives and the incentives of private aid delivery are spot on, and I think they're worth exploring. And I'm just going to I love this book. It's a book by Eleanor Ostrom, who's an institutional economist, and it's called Aid, Incentives, and Sustainability. It was an evaluation she did for Swedish SIDA, back in 2002. It's about 20 years old, and it really it gets to the heart, I think, of some of the incentives that that are set out within private aid delivery. So when we're contracting private consultants or whatnot to deliver aid, they're very much incentivized to deliver activities and very short-term results. And it's a fascinating account. So I would highly recommend to look at that. Just on the issue of bypass, my third point, I think it's worth pointing out, but I think that it could be unpacked, and the way in which donors work through vertical systems, but then also I think an example of the COVID response is an interesting one insofar as Canada has done a lot of work through Act A to support the delivery of vaccines, but at the same time we've moved a lot of bilateral assistance into health system strengthening work. So this idea that on the one hand, we may be bypassing through vertical systems like Act A or Gavi. And I'm not necessarily sure I like the term bypass, but anyway, that's we don't need to discuss that now. But we do complement that often with other kinds of institution strengthening work, and we definitely, there's no question, there's a recognition that these two things need to go together. So yeah, the question of bypass, I think we really need to unpack that and understand. I mean, on the one, I would say that if we want to talk about direct support to governments, we've seen that decline significantly. Direct budget support has declined significantly over the years, but has that been taken up by other forms of, say, private delivery that works directly to build capacity of local governments? That gets me to my last point. The way forward for some of these questions around the issue of localization, where we're very much looking at differentiating the state or government and looking at which parts of any national government may be the most effective partners moving forward, and maybe in some cases, and this is a larger point I maybe should have started with, aid effectiveness and the ability to deliver results, whether they're short-term or whether they're longer-term results, have forced us to look at a variety of actors. And I would just note that the kind of the global compact around development effectiveness as it's laid out in the Busan Principles and the Paris Declaration, and the importance of now looking at multi-stakeholder partnerships that include the private sector, include local governments as opposed, well, in perhaps opposed to national governments, but as kind of important actors in and of themselves. And how do we manage those multi-stakeholder relationships and look to be as effective as possible? I'm going to leave it at that. So thank you, Stephen and Simone.
Great. Thank you so much, Drew, for being on the point and concise. And I see Simone taking notes. So we'll give you, Simone, sort of first right of rebuttal or engagement once Sajjad has made his comment, and then we'll open it up to Q's and A's. Invitation to all of you who are listening in to put some questions in Q's and A's. I only see one so far, and we're expecting more, of course. So over to you, Sajjad.
Well, thanks, Stephen. And like Drew, I'm going to be brief. First of all, thanks, Simone, for writing this book, for focusing our attention on the nuts and bolts of the aid business. It's not, people don't consider that to be attractive, but that is the heart of where the aid business is at this point in time. So I have like Drew, I have a few points, and they're generally confined to the donor country aid delivery process. So point one. I totally agree with the conclusion that the delivery process is predominantly determined not by recipient country considerations, but by the public service rules and regulations in the donor country. I have two observations there. In your neoliberal construct, the donor government is generally more of a policy setting institution, with the delivery of the programs assigned to non-public entities. Here, the emphasis is on output and outcome level results to satisfy the overall system requirement, for achieving results, as well as the perception that public demand to know what was achieved with the taxpayers' money. In contrast, France and Germany are more statist in their governments and are predominant, the governments are predominant deliverers of domestic social services. So that kind of floats over to the aid side as well in the way they operate. The second observation here is that the public service incentive structures, the domestic incentive structures in the donor countries, have a lot to do with how aid is delivered. The structure depends on the prevailing philosophy of the public service. For example, what does it value more, knowledge or process management? In many northern countries, it is now the process aspect which dominates. This is in favor of the neoliberal practices of devolving delivery to more knowledge-based non-governmental organizations, because the government does not simply have the knowledge, the in-country or developmental knowledge to design or implement a development program. It has lost it, really. An example of this is the rotational employment system, which is, by the way, extraordinarily colonial. I mean, it dates back to really colonial administrative systems, especially at the senior management level, which puts emphasis on process management rather than knowledge. My second point is the status of the developing countries have evolved radically since the aid game started. This is something that Stephen was alluding to. There are now more middle-income countries than low-income countries, 111 as opposed to 34. This calls for different aid strategies for forming actual development partnerships with the country in the driver's seat rather than development assistance. This has proven to be not difficult for northern donors who are colonial by nature. The appropriate new developmental alliances call for a mix of whole of government approach involving the non-governmental actors as well. In fact, what would be desirable at this point is a hybrid between a neoliberal and a statist approach in order to address the development challenges in the middle-income countries. The third point is that the focus on so-called results, especially at the output level and the outcome level, and on process management, has led to risk-averse behavior in designing aid programs. As a result, most donors still concentrate on programs that can show quantitative output results, particularly in the areas like health and education, more suitable for low-income countries. The problem is that the middle-income countries, these may not be the right targets. We have not yet kind of figured out how to work with the middle-income countries. The fourth point is, one delivery aspect that is often missed is the inability of aid organizations to make quick changes. This is because this has nothing to do with philosophy. This is purely mechanical. This is because most of the budget is spoken for or committed in a given year, and the new programming coming on board that has come on board in a given year has been in the works for the last 2 or 3 years at least. The gestation time on average is 24 to 36 months for a new project, right? So in fact, the margin for making changes in any given year is very, very slim in budgetary terms. This has often led to the creation of envelopes of ad hoc funds reserved for special purposes. Part of the purpose is sort of setting aside funds, setting aside a pool of funds for to be used for some purposes, for some policy aspects, and so on and so forth, so that it is not taken away by the existing commitments. But the problem with that is it predicates against predictable program budgets that lead, and thus it leads to an inability to do long-term planning. Finally, let me talk, like Simone, a little bit of the future. What's going to happen in the future in terms of especially for Northern donors. So the movement to process-based administrative structures and the parochial and isolationist movements evidenced during the pandemic will likely lead to a concentration of Northern aid to global public goods, like climate change, like dealing with pandemics, like dealing with conflict, that is of immediate import to the North, delivered through organizations led by Northern institutions. So in effect, it is an extenuation of the bypass construct. This will further exacerbate the bypass process and to a neglect of country-specific issues. So from a Northern, but finally, last point, the book concentrates on non-donors. And it would be interesting to see what the donor landscape would look like if we included the new donor, so-called new donors, the other donors beyond the DAC donors, to see what the process is like and how the process works out. So that's it. Once again, thank you for focusing on the public sector and delivery rate. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sajjad, for those comments and for bringing in our research on middle-income countries as development partners and as donors, new donors, right, in this very changing global landscape. Simone, over to you just for a few minutes, please, because I now have 7 questions in Q's and A's that I would like to read out after you've given a first round of responses to Drew and Sajjad.
Yes, thank you. I'm monitoring the questions too, so that's I'm aware that they're there and what they are. But so let me take, like you said, just a few minutes to respond to these excellent comments, and I'm just going to pick the ones where I feel like additional words are like additional explanations are important. So Drew, I'm going to focus on your comment about unpacking bypass because I think it's an important one. And for me, the bypass refers to the first instance of delegation. And so like you say, in the context of public-private partnerships or IO trust funds, once that first delegation takes place, after that, the IO or the public-private partnership takes over accountability for the donor and essentially ensures then that cooperation with the recipient government is going to work as planned and the aid gets implemented or the institution is built as desired by the bilateral aid that essentially goes through Gavi, for example, or these trust funds. And so there is direct support or engagement with the government. That said, if we look at the way in which both trust funds and Gavi as an example operate, they all bring in their external systems and essentially impose them on their interactions with recipient governments. So yes, the mechanism is there, but the way in which these trust funds or these public-private partnerships engage with national authorities is also a bit colonial, if you will, in the sense that it requires them to follow an accountability protocol that corresponds with the initial bilateral donation. Moving on to Sajjad, 2 points. One, I thought was particularly interesting to me intellectually in the sense of how do we move forward? You talked about a hybrid model. I actually wanted to make sure that people understand that donors don't just do one or the other, but they tend to do more of one than the other, right? And so they're systematically more likely to engage, but across all donors, both government engagement and bypass exists. And so if we think about complex recipient countries like Afghanistan, I think in particular, where we see that we both need short humanitarian and basic needs aid for the short term, but also the recognition that if we throw everything at bypass, how can we expect at the same time that institutions or democracies grow in regions that are inherently fragile? And so for me, the way forward is to think of this moment in time as a critical juncture. We have the rise of China, we have all these development challenges in fragile states that should actually push Western donors to coordinate more with one another across different types. And so rather than mingling with the like-minded and doing more of the same, is really to coordinate at the country level, at the recipient country level, and thinking about comparative advantage and competencies that both types of donors bring. And then finally, on the new donors, I'm thinking of China, or the issue of climate change. Sajad, you suggested that you are seeing more of the same in terms of bypass. But what we're observing today with the energy shortages now caused by the Ukraine war, I could also imagine that now donors are going to redirect some of their development assistance towards accessing the kinds of resources that are needed to across developing countries to guarantee their own energy supplies, right? And so I think this will be it'll be interesting times to study this. And finally, the rise of China, the rise of new donors is something I have struggled with a bit. To me, China is a non-democratic actor where the institutional constraints mechanism, I have trouble seeing it apply. The way that China acts is that it may ask for the recipient government what it wants to have funded, but the way it then delivers aid is bypass on steroids, in the sense that they bring in their own workers, their own. It's very tied aid, which is sort of inconsistent with how the North defines development assistance. And so I'm struggling a little bit with how to square or how to bring in these very different donors in my framework, but it's an important point.
Great. So fascinating discussion on all of these issues. So there are 11 questions now. If I read them all, that will take the 5 minutes or 7 minutes left in our session. So let me just pick two out, Simone, and urge you to reflect on those. First, the second question from our colleague, Gadis and Sami, who's at Carleton University. And a second question is for a Canadian audience. I wonder whether you could say something about the Canadian case. Where would it rank along the managerial / neoliberal versus traditional public sector scale? And I would add, why? What do you think the factors? I mean, I'd love to hear Drew and Sajad give their hunches about where the Canadian case fits too. I have my own, but I'll hold back. The other question that I invite you to address, Simone, and indeed the other panelists, is in fact posed by two colleagues, Themriz Khan, who's in Karachi. Thank you, Simone, for your analysis. But does your book address the recipient's standpoint on aid? There can be no innovation or change in aid without including the recipients and its stakeholders in the conversation, the analysis, its government, civil society, academics, social movements, etc., and so on. And that is echoed by anonymous attendee X towards the end. I'm curious to know whether the research identified a difference between international assistance that has been prioritized, defined and designed by recipient governments or recipient local governance structures rather than being based on a donor-led agenda and delivery modalities, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so the Canadian question and the bigger question about Southern perspective, stakeholders, and approaches as alternatives.
Yeah. So thank you very much for these questions. Now I'm going to start with the recipient, the role of the recipient country. And so in this book, I really focus on sort of the donor perspective. And so it's not an attempt to, or it doesn't bring in other than donor characteristics, right? Whether whether or not that are captured in the statistical analyses, like colonial ties, or whether there was a natural disaster, economic development, etc. So I account for recipient characteristics, but I'm not modeling a process in which recipients are perhaps responding or even anticipating these preferences of aid donors. And so this would be really sort of a natural next step, where you move away from the domestic donor politics side towards a model that essentially creates like a bargaining logic between the donor and what it is that donor wants to maximize, and then contrast that. And sometimes it'll overlap, but sometimes it'll be inconsistent with what the donor wants, and then thinking about the conditions under which recipients have more or less say in what and how aid is delivered. Now, this is something I haven't done, but there are researchers in political science, Matt Winters and others, who have tried to get at this more from a donor-recipient bargaining perspective, but this is not part of the book other than thinking about recipient characteristics. Regarding the Canadian question about Canada, thank you for asking it. And I would actually like to throw the ball to Drew, because I had to make a selection of countries, and in the early stages, I was hoping to also cover Canada. I did some interviews with Canadian aid officials, and from those, and looking at the structure one or two times with some timelines of how the structure has changed over time, I would put it in the managerial camp. But I would actually like to for Drew to fill me in here and maybe tell me how I'm wrong, or whether my hunch is correct.
Thanks, Simone. Drew, over to you.
Sure, thanks. No, I would say that, within your broad framework, Canada is certainly, in contrast to Germany and France, very much more on the managerial neoliberal side. I think in part that's explained by the capacity of the government of Canada to actually engage with partnered governments, say in the way that the Germans do. I mean, we have no equivalent of whatever GTZ has become, whether it's BMZ, BIZ, I can't remember now. We have no direct technical support capacity that we provide through the government of Canada, and that has been the case for at least as long as I've been here. Going back to the 70s, perhaps there was that capacity, but since then, since the mid 90s, we have certainly relied on others, whether they're global funds or UN agencies, Canadian CSOs, contracted consultants, to deliver on behalf of the government of Canada. So in that sense, we don't have that kind of traditional capacity to engage governments. But what I would say, though, is that we do have a very complicated set, no, I shouldn't say complicated, but kind of diverse set of mechanisms by which we engage partner governments. And this is why I find the bypass, if we define bypass as two things, say direct budget support and the ability to engage directly, kind of public sector to public sector, Canada is by definition then very much on the managerial side. The amount of direct budget support or other forms of budget support provided to partner governments now is very, very small. It's less than 5% of our international assistance. However, the ways in which we engage through, maybe not through global funds, but through UN agencies and other ways, directly with governments, directly through contracted Canadian consultants or Canadian CSOs, or working directly with local CSOs, I would say that we continue to engage governments directly with the intent of building capacity and improving governance within their systems. Now, that doesn't meet the criteria that you set out in your response to my initial point, Simone, which was to move away from that, that first delegation of funding authority away from the government to some other entity. That is, by definition, almost everything we do. Mm-hmm. So that's where I find this idea that bypass, we are choosing to not work directly with governments for the most part because we don't have certain kinds of capacity within the Canadian public sector, or we choose not to provide direct budget support. I just think we need to really be careful about, labeling everything we do then as a bypass mechanism, mm-hmm. and not taking into consideration the need to build, local, national governance capacities and institutions. Thanks.
That's a very important nuance, Drew, and I think Simone addresses it in her book, but it's perhaps buried in the dense narrative. So when you publish your next article, Simone, you might want to explore that a little bit and some of the other issues that were raised. Sajjad wants to come in on this last round. We're over time, but Sajjad, go ahead, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, very quickly. Just building on Drew. On the Canadian model, I probably have more experience than he does because I was there before he was. So we have evolved from, in fact, what was direct involvement with the government at the beginning, in the early stages of the age game, to sort of moving towards a more managerial, sort of hybrid kind of stuff, depending on the circumstances. Right now, the Canadian system employs, like the US and the UK, a secondary delivery organization which delivers aid on behalf of Canada, and the Canadian government officials essentially manage the contract, if you like, as you put it. But nevertheless, we through the UN and our contributions to the UN and trust funds and etc., we do directly work with the government still. But this leads me to the second question, which I think this recipient country government agenda. The first thing is, given the evolution of these countries are 90% of these countries are no longer aid dependent. Mm-hmm. So they don't have to listen to you anymore. The middle income countries particularly, the aid is less than 1% of GDP for these countries. So the only ones that are aid dependent somewhat is the low income countries, and there the aid givers, the northern donors, have some sway, at least the colonial sway. The other part on that is, I did some research on SDGs, and in particular, the attitude of the developing world towards SDGs. And it's kind of striking in the sense, in comparison to the MDGs. And the difference was this: MDGs were considered, in a planning sense, as the start of a plan. So the governments of these countries would plan on the basis of MDGs. I want to achieve these MDGs, this is what I have to do. So when you looked at the SDGs from that perspective, SDGs did not become the goal, are no longer the goal in predominantly almost all the countries. They are more like the indicators So basically, these countries are saying, I want to do this, and look, it fits. An indicator of my success is this SDG. And that speaks volumes to the attitude of most of these recipient countries, because that implies to me that they're taking the ownership of development themselves, right? So they're no longer in some sense. So in fact, I push it to the extreme in many of my writings, where I say that in fact, in most of these middle income countries, the northern donors especially are faced with a choice. Either they take the secondary role as supporting the agenda of the recipient country, of the government's agenda, or they can buzz off, right? The amount they provide is so insignificant compared to what the development expenditures in those countries are from alternative sources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is that they are no longer important players. Okay? So to the answer to the question, as of now, given 111 middle-income countries and 34 low-income countries, the recipient country government's agendas are becoming tremendously important as far as development. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah. Excellent. So Simone, a lot of food for thought, hopefully, that you've received from this. If you want, you take a minute to respond to anything you'd like, and then we'll have to wrap up, unfortunately.
Yeah. So thanks to my discussant. I mean, for just helping me learn a little bit more about the Canadian case. There's lots of research that can happen both in terms of disaggregating bypass, the term, right, and the different non-NGOs, IOs, private sector. These are very different actors, right? And so thinking about the extent to which they probably need a slightly more nuanced explanation, I think is important. And some of my PhD students are actually working on that front. And then sort of the issue that Sashad talked about is, the sort of the northern donors, as he says, as well as south to south, global south or south to south cooperation is also, I think, an issue that is going to become ever more pertinent, right? Also for donors, Western donors, to understand the extent to which they compete. They're different too, these new donors. So your institute is doing important work on that front. And so let me just say, overall, I learned a lot from this exchange today, and I'm very glad that I had the opportunity to present the book in front of a Canadian audience. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Simone, for taking the initiative and inviting us to this conversation. It's been a long time, but we prepared this together very well, and I think the results today were very rich. Hopefully as rich for you and informative for you as they were for us. Hopefully they will incentivize you to actually write up that Canadian study or complete it with us, and we'd be happy to help. As you can tell, we're quite taken by your analysis and to what extent it might be helpful in understanding some tendencies in Canadian aid delivery that have perhaps not received enough attention. So thank you, Simone. Thank you, Drew and Sajad, for your excellent comments and provocation. The provocation about colonial attitudes of Northern donors is still out there. I think we'll have to organize one, if not many more sessions on that. It's a shout out to you, Themries, and all the other colleagues in the South and elsewhere who are working really seriously on that set of big issues. So thanks again. Thanks to CIPS, Anna, Mike, and others for hosting this panel. And let us definitely continue the conversation offline through other platforms. So have a good rest of the day wherever you are in the world.